It's crazy, but Amazon Games have looked at the current PvP meta and will be renaming the game into Tank and Liberty before the global release. Now, that is of course a joke, but the rest of the video isn't, and I hope it will be useful for new players or someone trying to learn more about PvP and weapon power in general. As you might have guessed, it's time to make a PvP class tier list in Throne and Liberty. Before we jump into it, I wanted to share a couple of disclaimers. I've been playing this game for over 8 months now. I was part of the original alliance that defended the castle and won the very first siege battle on our server.
We got no loosen, boys, let's go!
I've started as a melee player. Moved on to try Crossbow. Then pure range DPS.
Down next, what's down next?
Then played a healer in the open beta, and mained a tank on the hyper boost.
Guardian pop. Start moving towards the back and bomb,
Now, if you're thinking, yeah, that's all fine, but why should I trust your PvP tier list specifically? And I would say, yeah, don't blindly trust it. Listen to what I have to say, see if my logic makes sense to you, and then go and check some other tier lists if you're trying to decide what to play. I just hope you find some useful information here. And in fact, I want this to be a part of a multi-video project. This specific video will focus on the meta and which weapon combinations are currently more powerful than others. And then I have another video on my channel, which I'll link in the description below, and that one is all about TNL class fantasies. I'm explaining how different weapons work, what playstyle do they represent. I'm comparing some of them to classes from other games or even other fictional heroes to give you better understanding of various weapon combinations and what they do. That video should be especially helpful if you're trying to decide which class to play in Throne and Liberty. It's all about picking the class that you might like playing long term, regardless of the current meta, because chasing metas can be exhausting and sometimes very expensive. So check that video out if you're unsure what to play for the global launch. Now, with all those disclaimers out of the way, let's rank these weapon combinations and see which ones are a must-have in your competitive PvP guild and which ones are pure garbage. We're gonna start with SNS Wand. I'll put it in S tier straight away. Now, what is so great about this combination? The SNS brings a lot to the table in terms of defensiveness, and then the Wand is of course the ultimate heal machine. The combination works absolutely amazing. If we think about the main pillars of what the tanks need to do is engage the enemy, disrupt the enemy Zerg or group, and then of course survive for as long as you can and protect your team members if you can. So in terms of what SNS and Wand does best, is of course survival. It can disrupt and can protect a little bit, but survival is the forte of this class really. You can fight outnumbered, you can out heal a lot of damage. If you're using your skills correctly and your skill rotations and you're using your block effectively, you're just an unstoppable, unkillable machine on the battlefield. And it's an absolutely meta class with not a lot of negatives, to be honest. Some people could say the damage that this class can dish out is less than others. Yeah, for sure, but you can still build heavy attack with your skills and then shield bash the enemy, you know, hit a lot of enemies behind them. Very effective way to disrupt on the battlefield really, and so it's not enough to knock it down to like a tier lower just because there's a little bit less damage. It does its role really effectively, you know, with the survivability and just being in the center of things, drawing aggression, and you know, being the classic tank in PvP and what it needs to do. It's a little bit difficult to level, but leveling in TNL is a breeze, so we're not really talking about that since it's a PvP focused tier list. So again, not knocking any points down for that. It's gonna stay strongly in the S tier because it's an unkillable healing machine, you know, disruption machine in the battlefield, the SNS Wand. All right, next one, SNS Greatsword. Straight into S tier as well, let's discuss that. Again, another perfect working combination. SNS already brings a lot to the table as we discussed, from survivability, you know, the block, you know, you obviously need that as a tank, you're avoiding so much damage, and now you have a great sword to pair with it, and just deal a lot of damage around you as well. Also, it provides survivability. It scales very well. You know, the combination, like the Greatsword scales from having a lot of max HP. That makes your SNS stronger in turn with CC, with additional hit. So great scalability. Of course, very, very good passives for like a tank, for a bruiser class. You know, you're having defenses, you can build into endurance, especially very, very strong in the current meta, or like end game meta basically, where a lot of endurance is available on gear. And so you can sustain a lot of damage, you can soak a lot of damage. The ultimate from the Greatsword allows you to protect your party members and transfer damage from them to you, which then you can, you know, endure and heal up, which is absolutely amazing. Again, perfect pillars of a tank where it can engage and can definitely disrupt, and then it's great at protecting and it's good at surviving. Also, insane crowd control is another strong suit of SNS Greatsword. The mass stuns from Greatsword, or even individual stuns, knockdowns, paired with all the pushes and pulls, so much effective crowd control options in your gear to choose from and fulfill that disruptor role on the battlefield. There's not a lot of negatives to talk about. Yes, you're not an absolute all-surviving beast, not as great as SNS Wand perhaps. You are gonna get, you know, killed eventually, and you're not going to be able to out heal as much damage as the SNS Wand, but SNS Greatsword, absolute machine on the battlefield, and it's going to be strongly in S tier as well. All right, our next pick is the SNS Dagger. I would struggle to put it right next to the other two options in the S tier. Let's put it in A tier for now. Now, what you're doing really effectively as SNS Dagger is the engage part of the 4 pillars of tank that we discussed a little bit earlier. In terms of the damage you dish out, you're probably doing a bit less than SNS Greatsword in general, and then your survivability, very good still, but probably not S tier if we compare it to SNS Wand, so it has to go into A tier for those reasons. Now, in terms of engage, you're absolutely a master of engage. Of course, you have the stealth, you know, to help you with the initial jump, but of course, you also have the leap, so you can get right into the middle of the clump. You're not going to be stopped by anyone on your way, and you can get there and be effective whatever you're trying to do. If you have the arquebus weapon, you pull everybody together, you're uninterrupted, you set up place for your team, and really that's where SNS Dagger excels at as a tank, as a PvP tank, is getting in there, setting up place for your team, and then surviving long enough for the team to capitalize on those plays. You're really focusing on that evasion from your gear and also from the passives, especially the dagger passives, and SNS passives also help you as well. So the combination works really well. You're still super effective as a tank, surviving longer than, let's say, your typical assassin classes, but yeah, you're not getting as much damage out of it as maybe SNS Greatsword, or sustainability and survive as SNS Wand, but it's a super strong, very confident, top of A tier class. All right, next one we have to talk about SNS Staff. Now, SNS Staff we're gonna put into B tier, and it's all because it's a very situational class, I would say. Now again, SNS brings all its strongest suits to the table here as well, and then what Staff brings is the ranged DPS, the damage you can dish out from the distance. You don't have to go right into the middle of it, so you don't potentially need to have as much sustainability, as much healing as these other classes need to have, but still, you're not overall, as an SNS Staff, you're not as effective of a tank maybe as the other two are that are in S tier, and the main reason is the synergy between two weapons. There's perfect synergies in some of these classes. Here it's a little bit less so. Well, first of all, because SNS is a purely melee weapon and Staff is purely ranged, so there's already a little bit of a disconnect right there. So that's why it makes this class so situational. This would work for somebody who needs to be survivable and needs to stay at the kind of edges of the fight perhaps, or somewhere in the distance, not in the very middle of it, like a shot caller or a guild leader. That would be one of the perfect classes for them. Staff still provides some survivability, some CC with the ice skills, and then SNS obviously is the survivability machine, and you can mix and match those. You can shoot some projectiles from the sidelines, and if you need to, you can get in the thick of it, help a buddy out, survive, and shot call while you're at it. So still a very strong class, but if we think about it, yes, you're doing damage, but you're not doing as much damage as you would be with SNS Greatsword if you got in the middle of it and you do your Gaia Crash and you do your damage skills and you're dishing out that mass CC as well on top of it. You're not at that level with SNS Staff. And of course, in terms of survivability, if people are determined to get you down, they will get you down as the SNS Staff. So it's not pushing those high tiers like SNS Wand would be with the S tier. It's going to have to stay in B tier because it's so situational. All right, SNS Bow is the next one. It will go right next to the SNS Staff for very similar reasons as we discussed as well. And again, with the bow though, you have some of the shielding capabilities with their protective shield. You have some of the healing capabilities on bow as well, but of course nothing compared to SNS Wand. And so it's nowhere near as strong as SNS Wand. Again, very situational build. It can work as a sidelines shot caller too, similar like SNS Staff. But what it brings to the build is not like the damage as much to the SNS itself, but more of like a setup and crowd control capabilities. So this type of like shot caller build or just a general like a ranged tank would mean you are trying to set up plays for your team, maybe for your whole guild with the mass tornadoes, crowd control abilities. The flash wave is useful. Basically your AoE and your disruption kind of carries the build a little bit from the bow side, and of course SNS just makes you super tanky, makes you survive the initial engage that maybe you actually set up as a shot caller, and that's why that build can work, but it's super situational. It's not new player friendly because you need to know what you're doing and you need to know why you're running SNS Bow specifically. If you're lacking something specific within these classic meta tank builds and you're looking for it in the SNS Bow, then go for it, but otherwise it's super situational. It's not as strong as the main tanks, so it's going to go into the B tier. All right, SNS Crossbow. Let's discuss it and let's try and figure it out. First of all, you are not as effective with the SNS Crossbow combination as you would be with some of these meta tanks at anything you're really trying to do. You're trying to survive and outlast the Zerg that you're fighting. You're gonna want to go with SNS Wand, maybe with SNS Dagger, getting in and out. And if you want to do massive damage, you have the SNS Greatsword to set up those engages. With SNS Crossbow, you have some damage. You can get in there, you can press your button, start spinning, but you're going to be dishing out damage, but you're probably going to get crowd controlled and you're going to get killed eventually. You don't have that sustainability of the other tank classes, and the SNS does nothing for your crossbow, almost nothing for your crossbow damage. So that combination just doesn't work altogether. And again, if we think about the core pillars of the tank that we discussed previously, the engage, the disruption, yes, it's kind of there, but really the survivability, the protect aspect of the tank is just not there with SNS Crossbow. So it's really not that effective, and it doesn't have this range kind of shot caller, controller of the battle aspects as the SNS Staff and SNS Bow have, where you can, engage from the distance, set up plays for your team. SNS Crossbow just doesn't do that very effectively, so it would stay in C tier for me. But because this PvP class tier list is focused also on new players who are trying to figure out these PvP classes, I would actually put it in F tier, and I would recommend avoiding it. Don't pick it up unless you really want to experiment and try something specific. I would say don't pick it up. It's not a strong combination. If you want to be a tank, go for other options here, and if you want to be a crossbow, you have other options that are more effective as well. And the only situation is where you're maybe thinking, I really want to play crossbow, but I need more survivability, so I need to put a sword and shield on. Well, it's not going to buff your crossbow gameplay. So yeah, avoid this combination, I would say, and let's put it in the F tier. Alright, so we're pretty much done with the tank role. We've mapped out some classes, pretty good spread here. Let's move on to the healers. And we're gonna start with Wand Bow. Now, not every wand combination is strictly a healer, absolutely not. But if you have a wand, in most of the combinations, people are gonna expect you to be the healer. Obviously, if you're picking up wand, you're kind of counting on some of those heals. So yeah, I'm gonna put it all in the healer role. And if we want to discuss the DPS aspect of it, we are going to, but mainly we're gonna focus on healing. And so Wand Bow, the ultimate healer in TNL. We're going to put it in S tier and we're going to discuss it. Obviously, you have the strong heals from the wand, and now you have the heals that can back it up from the bow. The bow always had a little bit of heals, but before the skill expressions, it wasn't really that high on the totem pole. You know, the combination itself, it didn't work as great in terms of the synergy as maybe something like Wand Staff for the heals, but now with the skill expressions, they really brought it up, you know, to the level of pretty much the best healer, the strongest healer in TNL. Even with the class that doesn't have a kind of a back bar, the support weapon that also heals. So let's say if it was a wand SNS healer, that would be sufficient in most situations. Maybe you want a couple of them in the group, or you know, more of them spread across the raid. But yeah, the wand is the primary healing weapon. So wand SNS is an effective healer as well on the battlefield. Of course, we looked at it as a tank, as a paladin here previously, but yeah, it's an effective healer. But Wand Bow can definitely put out a lot more healing, a lot more sustained healing, bursts as well. Basically, if it's allowed to be uninterrupted on the battlefield, it can sustain somebody absolutely amazingly. So very, very strong healer, works in PvP as well. You know, has the shields that protect you from poison, basically weakens from the bow. Obviously, you can heal up if you lose some HP with the wand, or a combination of both. It has some crowd control to get your enemies off or to stop them until your team helps you. So Wand Bow is really strong. It's gonna sit in the S tier as kind of the ultimate healer in TNL. Okay, so Wand Staff is next. I can't really put it anywhere but next to Wand Bow as well. This is a very strong healer. In fact, it was the ultimate healer before the bow kind of got brought to higher level, and a lot of healers were running Wand Staff. Obviously, the wand is the ultimate healing weapon, and then Staff provides a lot of benefits to the wand in that combination. Of course, both weapons are ranged, so you're staying kind of behind in the back lines and keeping your teammates alive in PvP. With the staff, you have the kit that provides you some crowd control, some escape with the blink out if you need to, with the frost smoke screen, and of course some other ice abilities, as your slows and kind of crowd control. You can dish out some damage, of course. What really carries it is the AoE damage that you could put on people from the distance and then just keep healing with your wand. Some protective abilities like shield, and especially useful to have is the pull from wand, where you can save somebody from a bad situation, from a bad positioning spot. So yeah, the Wand Staff, really very, very strong healer in TNL, works in PvP. Kind of the negatives on both Wand Staff and Wand Bow is the survivability. Of course, you don't have the luxury of the dagger to get away, but you have some defensives, and if you're positioning correctly and you're playing the class to your fullest, Wand Staff is definitely a strong healer. It's gonna stay in S tier for me. All right. Wand Dagger. This is going to be an interesting one. It has a wand, so it's already pretty strong. Now, as a healer, it is definitely not as strong in terms of just healing throughput as a Wand Bow or Wand Staff, so I can't really put it next to them here. Of course, you have the benefits of the dagger passives, so the crit passive specifically, where you heals with crit more. But if we think about the effectiveness of the healer on the battlefield, especially in the bigger scale like guild v guild, zerg v zerg situations, I would probably prefer an SNS Wand or like Wand SNS healer to support me than a Wand Dagger, than an average Wand Dagger, I would say, and I will explain what I mean. Or, of course, one of the classic healers, if they have good positioning, they will just feel like they're dishing out very, very strong heals to your team and basically are very effective in your raid. Now, Wand Dagger, of course, it's not just a healer. It can also be like a bomber setup or bomber playstyle where you go in, you're invisible, you get in there, you do a mass sleep, you kind of set up this play for your team, and then your team engages on that. So the sleeps, the curses, they're really strong, and the stealth, of course, from the daggers allowed the wand to almost guarantee, or really actually just guarantee, those setups at the moment with the instant sleep, where, you know, the Wand Dagger can be effective. All right, but here are the negatives of Wand Dagger. It requires such an amazing knowledge of macro, basically positioning, how the engages go, you know, where the team is going to go. You know, the player needs so much knowledge about the game to effectively play Wand Dagger to its full potential. If you played Wand Dagger your whole TNL career and you mastered it and you absolutely love it, you're gonna argue that it's higher than B tier. It's probably a strong A tier, and I would probably agree with you. But for everybody just picking up a class or picking up the game and trying to figure out how, you know, the classes really fairly stack up against each other, I would say Wand Dagger is a very, very strong B tier, very high B tier, almost like on the border of getting into A tier for sure. But I'm gonna put it in the B tier so that it doesn't confuse the new players. It's kind of hard to pick up. It's really, really hard to master, but once you do, it's a very strong weapon. It would be there in the very high tiers. We're just gonna leave it in B tier for now because of how difficult it is to really play well and bring as much value to your team as a Wand Bow, Wand Staff healer can do, or SNS Wand on the battlefield as well. All right, and then we have Wand Crossbow. For me, this combination doesn't really work that well. Let's think about what Crossbow really brings to your wand. So Crossbow is all about firing quick moving projectiles, buffing all those projectiles as you're shooting and kind of getting more damage out of it. It's a damage focused weapon, assassin kind of type focused weapon. It does very little to your wand. It can work in PvE, of course, but since this is a PvP focused tier list, other backbar weapons, other secondary weapons really help your wand playstyle a lot better. Again, Sword and Shield just makes you so much tankier, so much more survivable if you're playing Wand SNS. You know, the bow, the staff are both ranged. The bow has extra heals and shields. The staff has the movement, you know, the slows, the pull. The daggers, obviously, they have stealth. They have passives that buff your wand itself. They have passives that buff your defensives when you need to. And of course, stealth just saves you in so many situations. Crossbow kind of has none of that. You know, Crossbow itself is quite a selfish weapon, not in a bad way, but it's selfish. It's all about, you know, empowering the wielder, empowering whoever deals damage with the crossbow, and it's not really giving too much to the wand. So that combination just doesn't work for me. There might be possibilities to cook up something, but generally in PvP, this synergy just doesn't work that great, and so it goes into the F tier. Alright, we're mostly done with the healer classes. Now let's move on to DPS, specifically gonna start with melee DPS, with something we can call a king of melee DPS potentially, and this would be a Greatsword Dagger. Now, would it land in S tier? I think not really. It's probably a very, very high A tier for me, and let's talk about why that is. Well, Greatsword, of course, works really well with daggers. What it brings is the passives first and foremost, the HP passive that then scales your hit, scales your CC really well. So, you know, your power, your DPS really comes from the Greatsword, and then it also comes from the daggers, and it's boosted by the daggers. If you go into your crit builds, you know, with the crit passives from the dagger, it's all gonna benefit this combination, and it just makes you an ultimate assassin. Now, why I say this combination is an assassin, of course you can play it as a bruiser as well. You know, you can focus on the Greatsword, focus on kind of surviving, getting a little bit more endurance and play it as a bruiser, but then you're probably more effective to just play the Greatsword SNS as an ultimate brawler, as an ultimate bruiser in the battlefield with the survivability of the SNS and basically keeping you in the fight. The bruiser of GS Dagger is more about kind of getting in there, dishing out damage, but then you have the escape of the daggers, and while you're escaping, you're of course less effective on the battlefield. You know, you're trying to get out, get back to your team. So as a bruiser, I would say Greatsword SNS is more effective, and that's why it so strongly sits in the S tier here, as both a tank and technically as a bruiser as well. But as an assassin, it's an absolutely, you know, best melee class to play. You have the kit, you have the leaps, you have the movement on both weapons really. The leap from Greatsword got buffed with skill expressions. The dagger leap was always great. Now it's even better. You can strike back if you want, you know, if you're built for it and if that's what you need to do. And of course, playing as an assassin, kind of maybe in an assassin group, or just generally picking your target, playing from the sidelines, pouncing on it, killing it in a couple of swings, potentially getting out. That's the playstyle this supports and fully empowers. Alright, so what are the real negatives of the GS Dagger? Well, you're probably not as survivable as some of these classes that are more tanky, that have the sword and shield to support their survivability. And what you're not going to be able to do as Greatsword Dagger is to jump into the middle of a huge Zerg, dish chaos, and still survive. In most situations, in the Zerg v Zerg, in the siege and open world boss battles, unfortunately you're sitting duck as soon as you jump into the middle of the enemies, and the range can kill you. So that's really a negative for large scale PvP, and you're going to have to be very smart playing Greatsword Dagger in open world in large scale PvP, and kind of pick your targets, pick your fights, jump in and, you know, assassinate and get out. And that's kind of the downside of the Greatsword Dagger that puts it for me like just below S tier, in the very high, in the top of A tier here. So that's going to be it for that. All right, next one we have Greatsword Bow. This one doesn't really work as a combination too well. And here's why. The Greatsword is all about mobility and buffing your melee abilities and buffing your bruiser playstyle. And Bow is all about kind of range DPS, of course, and it's kind of getting its benefit from standing still, extending the range. You know, some weapons have extra range on it. If you're building Bow, you're building for range and you're building for that crit damage. If you're building for Greatsword, you're building for that survivability on top of your damage. So you're not really building in the same direction with the Greatsword Bow if you're like trying to play it as a main build. That doesn't really work that well. Where it would work is, of course, taking the best from the Greatsword, specifically the crowd control or sometimes AoE crowd control abilities, and mixing it with some of the best things from Bow, which is of course range DPS and some crowd control on top of that. So now we have a mix of a lot of crowd control options. Where can we utilize that? Well, this is something that maybe like another shot caller or maybe like a group lead could utilize. You know, you would come in, set up a play for your team with the Greatsword and the Bow, and kind of then keep DPSing from the sidelines, jump in with the occasional stun. You know, that could be a playstyle, but it's really a weird playstyle and a very specific, and it doesn't really work as a main build that well, so it goes in the C tier for Greatsword Bow. The build kind of becomes like a strong controller build, but it doesn't do anything else that well. You don't have the daggers to go stealth or SNS to support your survivability. And then on the other side, you know, you have the bow, yeah, but the bow is not boosted too much by the greatsword. You know, you don't have the crit passives from the dagger. You're not using another ranged weapon like a staff, for example, in combination with the bow. So the bow is not really getting fully boosted from the greatsword. So the combination doesn't really work that well. And another greatsword option is Greatsword Staff, very similar to Greatsword Bow, another off-meta option, to be honest. Again, similar things apply. You have one melee weapon and one range weapon. They don't pair as well together. They kind of boost each other a little bit, but not enough, like a bow would boost staff or vice versa. You know, it's not boosted by the greatsword so much. You still have a lot of lockdown possibilities. You have the stuns, you have the prone, and then you have massive damage, massive range damage coming from staff. So it's very situational, and other combinations would do things better than this one. But I've seen people have some success with playing staff greatsword. So if you are absolutely desperate to play staff, for example, and want the lockdown that the greatsword brings, or you wanna like main a Gandalf type class, then, you know, it can work. I'll put it in front of the greatsword bow, but it's still gonna stay in C tier. I just cannot put it as high up as, you know, as some of these classes in the B tier, because SNS Staff, at least it's very situational, but at least it has its own specific use case, as same as SNS Bow, you know, shot caller builds, survivable, calling from the sidelines. GS Staff can achieve some of that, but really you're better off upgrading to SNS Staff for those specific situations. And then of course some of the other builds are just better, so GS Staff is gonna stay in C tier for now. Alright, Greatsword Crossbow, another interesting one. Definitely an off-meta build, but people have had good success with it. It's already better than the Greatsword Staff or Greatsword Bow combo. First of all, because it synergizes a lot better. It's a melee weapon with a mid-range weapon, and it kind of supports each other, but it's very, very dependent on the meta. It works in the current meta, so I'm gonna put it in B tier, and I'm gonna explain what I mean. So the crossbow is currently kind of a one-trick pony. How it plays in the current endgame meta is it dishes out a lot of damage around itself when it goes for its spin to win move. So it jumps in, spins around, dishes a lot of damage, AoE damage in the close vicinity, and hopefully defeats a lot of enemies in the process. Now, if it's interrupted, like it's stunned, you know, CC'd, or it's killed in that process, obviously it's less effective. So how do you prevent that? Well, you use your greatsword for that initial engage with the AoE stun. And that's where people found success with it, with this combination specifically, is building for that bomber setup, going in with the stun and then spinning with the crossbow and hoping that they don't get CC'd in time and that they can get a lot of enemies with them before they go back to the respawn screen. Now, that's pretty much why it's going to sit here in B tier. It could, but depending on meta, it could go, you know, down a tier, it could go up a tier, but as I said, it's very meta dependent. Before, the crossbow was a single target assassin, get in, kill somebody real quick and get out. Now it's kind of shifting to this mass bomber build supported by the greatsword. I've only seen it really be effective, you know, from a couple of players. A lot of players have tried it, but only a few have been really annoying to their enemies with it. So I can't put it in A tier, because that would mean it's a very consistent, kind of definitely a meta build. No, people are trying to make it meta, but not a lot are succeeding. So although it can be effective, it's gonna stay in B tier for now. Alright, so another greatsword build left. This is Greatsword Wand. A very weird combination in terms of, like, this could be described as having an identity crisis in a build, because are you a melee DPS, which is a greatsword supposed to be, or are you a healer, or even like a sleep bomber, which is Wand supposed to be? Now, if you're a healer, you have better options, infinitely better options, whether you need survivability on top of your heals, your SNS Wand, whether you just need to boost your heals and become the ultimate healing machine, your Wand Bow. If you want some AoE damage and some utility like pulling your teammates around, your Wand Staff. So why would you need a Greatsword in this combination? Well, on paper, it kind of works because the Greatsword scales with max HP. And so if you're stacking HP and stacking endurance and you have the heals to sustain yourself and you have the ultimate shields that kind of tether to other 5 people in your party and transfer some of the damage to you, reduce the damage, and then you heal yourself up, it sounds like it's supposed to work in some combination, as well as, let's say you're going in for a sleep bomb and then engaging on it, you know, following your own sleep bomb with an AoE stun. There's some combinations that in theory, it sounds like they can work together, but I've just not seen it working effectively. I've not, seen a lot of success from players trying it. So I think this build just needs to stay longer in the oven. And to be honest, to be consistent with the tier list, like we discussed, some of these builds not being new user friendly, new player friendly. So not to confuse anybody, don't start with Greatsword Wand unless you know what you're going to try. And you know the risks of going off meta, completely off meta build to achieve something special. But what I really mean is the build is probably a C tier and it just needs some cooking to really explore what it can do or where it can be useful. So I would say don't touch it for now, but watch this space because something might come out of this. Alright, so we're pretty much done with melee DPS or just a Greatsword section. And we're gonna swap straight into the range DPS by starting off with what I would call a king of range DPS. Yes, even in PvP, is gonna be Bow Staff or Staff Bow. This combination really works well together. It's 2 ranged weapons, both benefiting of each other to make you into like an ultimate range DPS turret. Pretty much a stationary machine gun that dishes out continuous damage, with some of the bows buffing your range and then some of the staff passives buffing your like range and range DPS in generally. So the 2 weapons work really well together, both dishing out a lot of damage with skill expressions. There's so many options to choose from. You can build around AoE damage with focusing on staff and then having your bow skills support you, finishing off enemies. And of course you have the reset, the blitz on the bow to reset hard hitting skills. And then of course you can build into single target DPS. Both weapons are capable of dishing a lot of that for small scale PvP. And you have your defensives, you have like little off heals on the bow, you have your protective skills on the staff, you have the shields, you have the ice skills, the crowd control, the movement skills, everything. It's a class that's very hard to master, but once you master it, you're not really feeling at a disadvantage for not having something like daggers in PvP. Yes, you have to stay at your distance, you have to do good positioning, you have to maybe sometime play the rat games and stay on top of some tower or on a wall and rain down hell from that. But yeah, it's an ultimate range turret and it's just very strong, consistent range DPS class. So it goes straight into S tier and it's probably gonna stay here for a while. Next up we have Staff Dagger. I would struggle to put it next to Bow Staff, the ultimate range DPS class. This one, it dishes a lot of range DPS. It has the dagger for stealth, you know, for survivability, for defensives, but ultimately it's just not as strong as Bow Staff at the moment. It still has quite a good kit. Previously, it has had a place in like S tier in specific bomber groups where Meteor was at its best, basically when it came out and people started leveling it. The Meteor build was, of course, you spin with the daggers to guarantee the crit, and then you shoot the Meteor from invis. That kind of got nerfed a little bit and is generally less effective. The meteor bombing is less effective because it's no longer just completely deleting just fields and fields of enemies. It's still effective in certain groups and, you know, for people that can play it well, but in general it just doesn't reach S tier at the moment for me. It's a strong range DPS class. It's the mage, ultimate DPS mage archetype. Some people would think that it's the Staff Wand. That's the ultimate mage, but as I mentioned, you are expected to heal as a wand, and wand has a lot of healing capabilities, a lot of healing passives. So really, if you want to go a DPS mage, you're probably better off going Staff Dagger in PvP. Again, in PvP, it provides you all those defensive abilities and stealth. Yeah, but yeah, it just doesn't go higher and doesn't reach the levels of DPS and kind of the utility that the bow staff, a good bow staff user can have. So it's kind of strong in A tier, but it's still only just A tier for now. So that's where Staff Dagger will land. All right, next one is Staff Crossbow. People really want to make it work. And on paper, it sounds like it would work well. You know, you have your staff that shoots magic projectiles, and then your crossbow that buffs projectiles. And honestly, it kind of works, you know, with the skill expressions. Now you have a lot of shooting projectiles from the staff, you know, your ice, your fireballs, everything just gets buffed by the crossbow. You can capitalize on your burn stacks. You can, you know, dish a lot of additional damage with the crossbow itself. You're either, you know, shooting from the sidelines, sometimes you're maybe going in for that bomb, but honestly it doesn't work as well as people want it to, and especially recently that the crossbow kind of keeps getting nerfed little by little. So because it's so meta dependent and it's so dependent on how powerful crossbow is, and it's not actually like a full-on build on it by itself, it kind of doesn't fully work. It doesn't work again as consistently as some of these other builds in A tier, so it has to be downgraded to B tier really, and kind of labeled as a very situational type of build that can work, and you know, you can have some success with it, but it's just not as strong as these top tier builds at the moment. I would say it's probably going in front of Greatsword Crossbow. Greatsword Crossbow can be more impactful than Staff Crossbow because of the AoE and if you execute the bomb successfully, but because I've seen so few people like actually successfully use this all the time, I would say that for newer people you're gonna find more success on Staff Crossbow, and for Greatsword Crossbow you're really gonna have to work for it and learn the game and learn the positioning and learn the engages. So for your average Joe, I would say, or just a new person, Staff Crossbow would sit just in front of Greatsword Crossbow, but really it's still in the B tier. It's kind of middle of the road. You have to make it work, you know, with your personal efforts. It's not gonna carry you like some of these builds are going to from the get-go. So it's a strong B tier, and it's gonna stay here, I think. All right, Bow Dagger. Your kind of classic ranger assassin type build, you know, ranged assassin potentially. The bow, very strong DPS weapon on its own, boosted in certain areas by the dagger passives, by the crit, by the poison if you're picking the right targets. Of course, you have the stealth. With the bow, you can refresh the stealth, which is very strong for PvP. So you have the escapes, you have the opportunity to get out. So it's really, really strong, a contender for the S tier, but I would think it cannot stand next to Bow Staff, to be honest, in terms of the DPS that it can dish out, just the pure DPS. And if you master Bow Staff and you can play without that stealth, without that escape, using your CC, using your slows, using your blinks effectively, this really becomes the ultimate S tier range DPS build. And this kind of gets knocked down by 1 tier into A tier, while still being very strong. And what it has going for it is it's very new player friendly. You will have easier time picking up this build, building it correctly. It's very intuitive in terms of what you need to do with it, how you need to play it. So it's very, very strong A tier build. It just cannot get on the level of Bow Staff in terms of range DPS right now. It has, crowd control. It has some utility in terms of off heals and some shielding. It doesn't dish out the ultimate levels of DPS, so it goes into A tier right next to Staff Dagger. Alright, the next one is also a very interesting one. It's the Bow Crossbow combination. Now, on paper, it looks like it would work really well. You have the big bow with the range, you have the crossbow with like buffing your shots. So there sounds like there can be something, but really it doesn't work well at all, to be honest. Now, first of all, when you're building your class, you're really focusing on different things when you're thinking about bow and when you're thinking about crossbow. Crossbow is all about that offhand proc, your bonus damage, a lot of projectiles, every projectile gets buffed. So that's how you would think about starting to build your crossbow. And then of course, crossbow is also all about mobility, the selfless infiltration, the mobility skills and the buffs you get after your movement. And then the bow, on the other hand, is a lot more static. It's like, you're shooting from range, you're staying in one spot potentially, you're not as mobile with the bow. And so those two don't fit together that well, they don't buff each other that well. Now, what you're trying to achieve, if you really want to play crossbow, then you're probably better off with starting with something like Crossbow Dagger and then potentially transitioning into some of these more niche, more interesting builds like Staff Crossbow or Greatsword Crossbow. But Bow Crossbow just doesn't bring anything to the table that other classes don't do better. Let's say Bow Staff is better at just pure DPS, being a ranged turret, like being, it's still mobile. When I say turret, don't catch on to that word. You're basically most effective at range, standing and dishing out damage, but you're still mobile if you want to be, and you have those movement skills. It's just not a focus of the class like the crossbow might be. So you're still getting more damage out of this class. If you really want to play bow, go Bow Dagger, go that kind of range assassination type of playstyle, with some escape, with the defensives. Now, if you play bow with the crossbow, you're losing a lot of those defenses, you're losing the stealth. Now, you're losing your stealth options, so it becomes a lot less viable, especially in large-scale PvP. You're kind of a sitting duck. You don't have that many escapes. You have to go into closer range because it's awkward. The crossbow is really a mid-range weapon. It's not a fully ranged weapon, so you have to be closer, and then you're obviously putting yourself in the path of danger, and so this build doesn't really work that well. Now, in terms of kind of comparing it to other things in B tier, it can't really be compared even with the low B tier combinations like Staff Crossbow and Greatsword Crossbow. If I think from like a perspective of building a comp, I want some Staff Crossbows in my comp, and I want some good Greatsword Crossbow players as well, because they're just so impactful if they know what they're doing. And I can't say the same about Bow Crossbow, so it will have to go into C tier. I'll put it into high C tier because it can work, and it's of course a farming machine in PvE, but we're not talking about PvE here. So for PvP, it's gonna go into high C tier. It's not really reaching B tier for me. Now we get to the Crossbow Dagger. This build is really, if you ask different people, you're gonna get all the different answers from I love Crossbow Dagger, this is the only build I'm ever gonna play, this is amazing, I just love it, to this is a useless build, it doesn't work, it doesn't do any damage against good enemies, it's just trash tier, don't pick it up, don't play it, absolutely nerfed to the ground. You know, it can range all the way from top to bottom depending on who you ask. Now, I'll put it in C tier and we'll discuss it and we'll see where it really goes. Now, let's talk about the positives first. You're absolutely a DPS machine with this. You're clicking your buttons, your skills are refreshing super fast. You never have, a dull moment. You're always off cooldown, just cycling through skills, shooting and moving and shooting, and both weapons work well with each other. Great synergy. This is a highly mobile mid-range assassin type weapon. Daggers are obviously the assassin archetype, ultimate fantasy, close range, leap in, deal a lot of damage, spin on them, try to get out, survive if you can. You're a glass cannon, you're dealing damage, and that's your sole purpose. Yeah, it works kind of okay in PvP. The more, the higher the scale of the PvP, the more people are involved. In GVG 70v70, it starts to fall off. You don't have, protection of some of these S tier combinations. You also don't have the lockdown that the Greatsword maybe provides you, but you do have some escape, you do have the defensives, your evasion passives kind of synergize well for this class with the gearing that you're gonna do for Crossbow Dagger. So really, I would struggle to push it into A tier. If it's a good player that's wielding Crossbow Dagger, they could go into A tier, but I wouldn't say it's consistently in A tier, and it's comparative to, and it can be compared to some of these classes like Greatsword Dagger, which is always strong, Staff Dagger, Bow Dagger that are super strong, SNS Dagger that does its job very well and consistently as a disruptor, as an engager, as somebody that sets up the fight. Crossbow Dagger is just not that consistent. It does do good damage, but you're not gonna have a lot of fun in siege. You're close range, you're gonna be shot down real quick. Even if you have that escape, you're not very effective when you're stealthing around and not engaging in the fight and not bombing. So I cannot put points for just having stealth. It's just an escape tactic. Now I can't also drop it into C tier. I mean, I can really drop it into C tier, but these are like experimental builds that don't really work in almost any situations. And these builds are quite situational, but we know they work in good hands. So it's kind of comparative to that. I don't think I can put it higher than the Wand Dagger, because Wand Dagger just has so many options with the bombs and with the healing, and just overall for PvP it's super strong. But I probably can put it before these situational builds like the tanky shot callers, and then these ones that need specific setup and specific knowledge of the game to be very, very good. Crossbow, you can be kind of good if you build correctly and this is your playstyle and your playstyle in and out. You can be effective with the Crossbow Dagger. In some metas you might find you're lacking a little bit of damage, and it's really dependent on the gear. You want to get a crossbow from Quinn Bellendir, you want to get a Tevan Dagger, and ideally if you cannot get those weapons, you're not as strong, you're not as effective. But ultimately I think it has to sit in B tier for me, somewhere in the middle, and so we're gonna have to leave it at that. So looking at this tier list overall and how it worked out, I would say I'm pretty happy with it. In the S tier, we have the builds that are very in demand and also consistently have been very strong, are very strong in the current meta with the skill expressions, super tanky builds here, ultimate healers, the ultimate range DPS are all sitting strongly in the S tier. And below that, we have also a good range of weapon combinations here. What I guess distinguishes this tier is all of these builds are super consistent. I wouldn't say they're superstars like these S tier builds are, but they're always consistent and they do their job well and they're strong in the correct hands. So they all deserve to be in A tier, and you're gonna have an awesome time playing these builds if you're not going for the S tier. A tier is still super strong, still super consistent. You're not gonna regret picking these up. Now, B tier is something that I would recommend you only pick up if you know what you're doing, if you know what you're going for, if you want to play a specific build for specific situations, like the sidelines shot caller, like the bomber with some CC that you know you're gonna make it work, or you have to play the crossbow dagger, that's your option here, or you want to play that sleep bomber, or you want to play the stealthy healer. That's where you would go for these builds, but you have better options for some of them in S and A tier as well. And then F tier is just something that I would not recommend for a new player to pick up. These builds are difficult to figure out, and even if you figure out and master them, they probably are not going to be as strong as some of these other builds at the moment. So watch this space for some of these builds to pop up and start climbing the ranks like Greatsword Wand. But for now, if you're just trying to figure out what's strong and what's not really used in PvP, then I would say avoid F tier for now. Now that we're done with this tier list, if you're still watching the video, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you found something useful. If you enjoyed this video, leave me a like. And don't forget to check out my other video about TNL class fantasies, where I explain how different classes play and what they represent in this game. Now remember, in Throne and Liberty, knowledge is currency. So subscribe and let's keep learning together. But for now, Crazy Trick out.